Lieutenant Rebecca Morrison stood at the entrance of Camp Sheridan in rural Pennsylvania, watching another convoy of trucks roll through the gates. It was April 1945, and the war in Europe was collapsing like a house of cards. German soldiers were surrendering in massive numbers, and they were all asking for the same thing: to surrender to American forces, not Russian. The camp, built to hold 5,000 prisoners, now held nearly 12,000, with more arriving every day. "Lieutenant Morrison, a word." Colonel Thomas Bradley stood in the doorway of the administration building, his expression stern. Behind him loomed Captain Dennis Walsh, a West Point graduate who made no secret of his contempt for women in uniform. Becca followed them inside, her stomach tight with apprehension. At 28, she had fought hard for her commission in the Women's Army Corps. She had a degree in international relations from Bryn Mawr and spoke fluent German, thanks to her grandmother who had emigrated from Berlin in 1920. But none of that seemed to matter to men like Bradley and Walsh. "Sir," Becca stood at attention. Bradley sat behind his desk, looking tired. "We have a problem, Lieutenant. These German prisoners keep coming and we're overwhelmed. We need someone to conduct intake interviews, process their information, and assess them for intelligence value." "I can do that, sir. My German is—" "We know you speak German," Walsh interrupted dismissively. "That's the only reason you're getting this assignment. Don't get any grand ideas about it being real intelligence work." Becca kept her face neutral. "What exactly are my responsibilities, sir?" "You'll interview incoming prisoners, complete their paperwork, identify their units and ranks, and flag anyone who might have useful intelligence for the actual intelligence officers to follow up on," Bradley said. "It's basically clerical work, but it requires German language skills." "I understand, sir." Walsh leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "The prisoners are arriving in groups of 200 to 300 per day. You'll work in the processing center with Sergeant Davis assisting. Keep the line moving. We don't have time for lengthy conversations." "With respect, sir, proper interviews might reveal important information." "Your job is to process them, not interrogate them," Walsh said sharply. "Leave the real intelligence work to qualified officers." After they dismissed her, Becca walked to the processing center, a large warehouse-like building with rows of tables and chairs. Sergeant Marcus Davis was already there, setting up. He was a career soldier in his 40s, African-American, and one of the few people on base who treated Becca with professional respect. "Heard you got stuck with intake duty," he said, offering a slight smile. "Stuck with it or earned it, depending on your perspective," Becca replied. "For what it's worth, ma'am, I think you're the right person for this job. Those German boys are scared, confused, and a long way from home. You treat people decent, and that matters." "Thank you, Sergeant. I appreciate that." "Also heard Captain Walsh saying this is just clerical work." Davis's expression hardened. "Man wouldn't know real intelligence if it bit him. Half of intelligence work is listening to what people say when they think nobody important is paying attention." Becca looked at him sharply. "That's very perceptive, Sergeant." "I've been in this army 20 years, ma'am. I know a thing or two about being underestimated." The first group of prisoners arrived that afternoon, 240 German soldiers, mostly young, all exhausted and relieved to be alive. They filed through the processing center in a long, weary line. Becca sat at the main table with Davis beside her, taking notes. She spoke to each prisoner in German, asking standard questions: name, rank, unit, where and when they surrendered. But she also asked one additional question: why did you surrender to American forces? The answers were remarkably consistent. "The Russians will kill us," said a young private from Munich. "We heard Americans treat prisoners according to law," said a corporal from Hamburg. "Better to live in an American camp than die in a Russian one," said a sergeant from Berlin. By the end of the first day, Becca had processed 83 prisoners. Her hand ached from writing, but her mind was racing. She had noticed patterns in their stories: entire units surrendering together, officers deliberately marching their men west to avoid Russian capture, rumors about American treatment of POWs spreading through the German army. That evening, she compiled her notes into a report for Colonel Bradley. She documented the patterns she had observed and suggested that the mass surrenders represented a significant intelligence opportunity. If German soldiers trusted American treatment, They might be willing to provide information about remaining Nazi strongholds, leadership locations, and military capabilities. The next morning, she was called back to Bradley's office. Captain Walsh was there, holding her report like it was contaminated. "Lieutenant Morrison, what is this?" Walsh demanded. "My daily report, sir, as requested." "I requested a list of names and units, not a strategic analysis of German surrender patterns." "Sir, I observed significant patterns that I believed were relevant." "You observed what you were told to observe," Walsh interrupted. "Names, ranks, units, that's it. We don't need your opinions on strategy or intelligence matters." Bradley held up a hand. "Captain Walsh, let's not be too harsh. Lieutenant Morrison was being thorough." "She was overstepping, sir. This is exactly what happens when you give women responsibility beyond their capabilities. They get emotional and imaginative instead of sticking to facts." Becca felt anger flash through her, but she controlled it. "With respect, sir, everything in my report is factual. I documented exactly what the prisoners said." "And added your own interpretations and recommendations. That's not your job." "Then what is my job, sir? To be a human typewriter?" Walsh's face reddened. "Your job is whatever your superior officers say it is, and right now it's to process prisoners efficiently without wasting time on amateur intelligence analysis. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, sir." As Becca left the office, she heard Walsh say to Bradley, "I told you assigning a woman to this was a mistake. They can't help but make everything complicated." Back at the processing center, Sergeant Davis took one look at her face and said, "Walsh shot down your report." "How did you know?" "Because I've seen it happen 100 times. Someone notices something important, reports it up the chain, and gets slapped down because they're not the right kind of person." His expression was knowing. "You and me, ma'am, we've got that in common." Becca sat down heavily. "I'm supposed to just process names and move on, but these men are telling me things, Sergeant, important things, and nobody wants to listen." "Then maybe you need to listen even harder and document everything, because when the truth finally matters, you'll have the evidence." Over the next week, Becca processed over 600 prisoners, and despite Walsh's orders, she kept detailed notes on everything they told her. She learned that many German soldiers had been deserting for months, fleeing west to surrender to Americans or British rather than fight to the death or face Russian capture. She learned that entire units had negotiated their surrenders, with officers making deals to bring their men in safely. She learned that many prisoners had witnessed war crimes and were terrified of retaliation from die-hard Nazis. And she learned something else, something that made her blood run cold. A prisoner named Captain Friedrich Weber, a career officer from the Wehrmacht, told her something during his interview that changed everything. "I surrendered because I have information," he said in German, his voice low and urgent. "Information about war crimes, about what happened in the camps. I will testify, but I will only speak to someone I can trust." "You can speak to our intelligence officers." "No," Weber's eyes were intense. "I have already tried. I told the guards I had important information. A captain came to see me, an American captain with red hair and a loud voice. Captain Walsh. I don't know his name, but when I began to tell him about the camps, about what I witnessed, he told me to keep my mouth shut. He said America doesn't want to hear about German problems. He said if I talked about such things, I would be sent to the Russians." Becca felt ice in her veins. "He threatened you." "Yes, but I must speak. What I saw, what we did. The world must know, for justice, for the victims." Weber's hands trembled. "Will you help me?" Becca looked at this man, this enemy officer who had served in Hitler's army, and saw something she hadn't expected. Conscience, courage, a desperate need to do the right thing, even if it meant condemning himself. "I'll help you," she said quietly, "but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" "You are the first person who has listened to me as if I am human," Weber said. "Yes, I trust you." That night, Becca sat in her small quarters, trying to make sense of what she had learned. Why would Walsh threaten a prisoner who wanted to provide information about war crimes? Why would he try to silence someone willing to testify? Unless he didn't want the information to come out. Unless someone had decided that prosecuting war crimes would be too complicated, too expensive, too politically difficult. Unless someone was trying to bury the truth. Becca thought about her grandmother, who had fled Germany when she saw what was coming. Her grandmother had always said, "Evil succeeds when good people stay silent." Becca had a choice. She could follow orders, keep her head down, and process prisoners like a machine. Or she could risk everything to make sure the truth came out. It wasn't really a choice at all. The next morning, she went back to work with a new plan. She would continue processing prisoners as ordered, but she would also document everything Weber and others told her. And when she had enough evidence, she would find someone who would listen. Someone who cared more about justice than about avoiding complications. Over the next 2 weeks, Becca interviewed more than 1,000 German prisoners. She worked 12-hour days, methodically processing each man while carefully documenting their stories in a separate notebook she kept hidden. Captain Weber wasn't the only one with information about war crimes. Dozens of prisoners had witnessed atrocities, concentration camps, mass executions, forced labor, medical experiments. Many were racked with guilt and desperate to confess, to somehow make amends for what they had seen or participated in. But Becca quickly learned that not all of them could be trusted. A prisoner named Lieutenant Hans Kruger tried to use information as currency, offering to reveal war crimes in exchange for preferential treatment and a guarantee he wouldn't be prosecuted. His information was vague and self-serving, clearly designed to implicate others while protecting himself. "I was only following orders," Kruger said with a slight smile. "I had no choice, but I remember everything. I could testify if the conditions were right." Becca looked at him with disgust. "I'll note your offer in my report. Will you recommend me for cooperation status?" "I'll recommend you for exactly what you deserve." After Kruger left, Sergeant Davis said quietly, "That one's a weasel, looking to save his own skin." "Yes, but Weber is different. So are about a dozen others I've interviewed. They're not making deals. They're genuinely haunted by what they witnessed." "That's good for justice, ma'am, but dangerous for you." "Why?" Davis lowered his voice. "Because I've been asking around. Captain Walsh has been interviewing some prisoners privately, and afterward those prisoners get transferred to isolation barracks. Nobody sees them again." Becca felt cold dread. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe Walsh doesn't want certain information getting out, and maybe he's making sure potential witnesses disappear into the system." Becca struggled to process it. "That's obstruction of justice. That's a crime." "Only if someone can prove it. And who's going to investigate a decorated officer based on the word of a Negro sergeant and a female lieutenant?" Becca understood what he wasn't saying. They were both outsiders, both easy to dismiss or discredit. If they made accusations without ironclad proof, they would be the ones who suffered. "Then we need proof," Becca said firmly. "How do you plan to get that, ma'am?" "I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out." That afternoon, Becca was processing a new group of prisoners when one of them, a thin, nervous man in his 50s, caught her attention. His intake form listed him as Dr. Ernst Hoffmann, a civilian medical doctor who had been conscripted into military service. When she interviewed him, his hands shook so badly he could barely hold his identification papers. "Dr. Hoffmann, are you ill?" she asked in German. "Ill in my soul, perhaps," he whispered. "I am a doctor. I took an oath to heal, but I was forced to participate in things that haunt me every hour of every day." "What things?" Hoffmann looked around nervously as if afraid of being overheard. "Medical experiments on prisoners, on children. I tried to refuse, but they said I would be shot. So I did what I was told, and I have hated myself ever since." Becca felt sick. "Where did this happen?" "Dachau. I can provide details, names, dates. I have kept records hidden in my belongings. I want to testify. I need to testify. It is the only way I can live with what I have done." "I'll make sure your information gets to the proper authorities." "No," Hoffmann grabbed her hand desperately. "You don't understand. I already tried. I told the guards I had important information. An American captain came to see me. Red-haired man, very angry. I started to tell him about Dachau, and he said such testimony would embarrass the American army. He said I should forget what I saw if I wanted to be treated well." It was Walsh again, the same pattern. "Dr. Hoffmann, I need you to trust me," Becca said carefully. "Keep your records hidden. Don't speak to anyone else about this. I'm going to find a way to get your testimony to people who will act on it. Can you be patient?" "I have waited this long with this burden. I can wait longer if there is hope for justice. After Hoffman was taken to the barracks, Sergeant Davis pulled Becca aside. Ma'am, you're collecting a lot of dangerous information. Walsh is going to notice eventually. I know, that's why I need to act soon. What are you planning? Becca took a deep breath. I'm going to go over Walsh's head, over Bradley's head if necessary. There has to be someone in the command structure who cares about prosecuting war crimes. That's risky, ma'am. You could get court-martialed for violating chain of command. And Walsh could be covering up evidence of genocide. I'll take my chances. That evening, Becca sat in her quarters and wrote a detailed report. She documented every prisoner who had tried to provide testimony about war crimes. She documented Walsh's pattern of threatening and silencing witnesses. She documented the suspicious transfers to isolation barracks. It was damning. It was also potentially career-ending for her if the wrong people read it. But she thought about Dr. Hoffman's shaking hands. She thought about Captain Weber's desperate need to confess what he had witnessed. She thought about all the victims who deserved justice. And she finished the report. The question was who to send it to. She couldn't trust anyone at Camp Sheridan. She needed someone outside the camp, someone with authority and integrity. She thought of her former professor at Bryn Mawr, Dr. Eleanor Hartwell, who had connections in Washington. Dr. Hartwell had joined the War Department as an advisor on international law and war crimes prosecution. Becca wrote a careful letter to Dr. Hartwell, enclosed her report, and mailed it from town on her day off, bypassing the base mail system. Now all she could do was wait and hope. 3 days later, everything fell apart. Becca arrived at the processing center to find Captain Walsh waiting for her with 2 military policemen. Lieutenant Morrison, you're confined to quarters pending investigation, Walsh said with barely concealed satisfaction. Investigation of what, sir? Unauthorized contact with enemy prisoners, conducting interviews beyond your assigned scope, and suspicion of fraternizing with the enemy. Becca's stomach dropped. That's absurd. I've been doing exactly what I was ordered to do. You've been conducting lengthy private interviews, asking unauthorized questions, and developing inappropriate relationships with prisoners. Multiple guards have reported your behavior as suspicious. I've been documenting their testimonies about war crimes. You've been wasting time on irrelevant matters instead of focusing on your assigned duties. Walsh stepped closer, his voice dropping. You should have stuck to typing names, Lieutenant, but you couldn't help yourself. Women always get too emotional, too involved. Now you're going to face the consequences. The MPs escorted Becca to her quarters. As she walked across the compound, she saw prisoners watching from behind fences. Some of them, men she had interviewed, looked worried. In her quarters, Becca sat on her bunk and tried to think. Walsh was moving against her, probably because he had found out about her report. But how? Had someone intercepted her letter to Dr. Hartwell? There was a knock on her door. Sergeant Davis entered looking grim. Ma'am, I heard what happened. This is bad. I know, Sergeant. But there's something you should know. Some of the prisoners are talking about staging a protest. They say you treated them fairly and they don't want to see you punished. Becca stood up quickly. You have to stop them. If they protest, it'll only make things worse for me and for them. I tried telling them that, ma'am, but that Captain Weber, he's pretty insistent. Says you're the only American officer who listened to him, and he won't stand by while you're railroaded. Please, Sergeant, make them understand. I don't want anyone else hurt because of me. After Davis left, Becca paced her small room, feeling trapped and helpless. She had tried to do the right thing, and now she was being punished for it. Walsh had outmaneuvered her. Unless her letter to Dr. Hartwell had gotten through, unless help was coming. But how long could she wait? And what would Walsh do to the prisoners who wanted to testify while she was confined? That night, Becca barely slept. She heard activity outside, trucks moving, orders being shouted. Something was happening. In the morning, Sergeant Davis came to her door again, this time with news that made her blood run cold. Ma'am, they transferred 50 prisoners overnight, including Captain Weber, Dr. Hoffman, and everyone else you flagged as having potential intelligence value. Transferred where? Nobody knows. The paperwork is classified, but the word is they're being sent to a camp in the middle of nowhere where they'll be kept isolated until they can be shipped back to Germany. Becca felt rage and despair in equal measure. Walsh was disappearing the witnesses. He was burying the evidence, and she was powerless to stop him. Or was she? "Sergeant, I need your help," she said quietly. "Anything, ma'am. I need you to get a message out, not through official channels, through back channels, to Washington, to the press, to anyone who will listen." Davis nodded slowly. "That's mutiny, ma'am. We could both hang for that. Or we could let Walsh cover up genocide. Your choice, Sergeant." Davis smiled grimly. "When you put it that way, ma'am, I guess I'm choosing mutiny." Sergeant Davis had connections Becca had never known about. 20 years in the Army had taught him how to work the system, how to get things done through unofficial channels, and most importantly, how to get information to people who could use it. "My cousin works for the Negro Press in Baltimore," Davis explained quietly during one of his visits to Becca's quarters. "They've been covering stories the white papers won't touch: war crimes, discrimination in the military, injustice. They'll listen." "Will they have enough influence to make a difference?" "Maybe not alone, but I also got a buddy who works in Army Postal Service at the Pentagon. He can make sure certain documents reach certain desks, if you know what I mean." Becca understood. Davis was offering to help her smuggle out information through channels Walsh couldn't control or monitor. "I can't ask you to risk your career for this, Sergeant." Davis looked at her steadily. "Ma'am, I've spent 20 years watching injustice happen and keeping my mouth shut because speaking up was too dangerous. I'm done being silent. Those German prisoners got more courage than me. They're willing to testify even though it means confessing their own crimes. The least I can do is help make sure someone hears them." Over the next 3 days, while Becca remained confined to quarters, Davis worked his network. He smuggled out copies of her detailed notes, her list of prisoners who had attempted to provide testimony, and a sworn statement from Becca describing Walsh's pattern of threatening and disappearing witnesses. Meanwhile, Camp Sheridan was locked down tight. Walsh had convinced Colonel Bradley that there was a security risk, that some prisoners might be planning an escape or an uprising. Guards were doubled, prisoner movements restricted, and all outside communications monitored. But Walsh had made one mistake. He had underestimated the prisoners themselves. Captain Weber, Dr. Hoffman, and the others had not been transferred out as quickly as Walsh had hoped. There were bureaucratic delays, paperwork issues, the usual military inefficiency. They were in isolation barracks, but they were still at Camp Sheridan. And they were talking to each other. On the 4th day of Becca's confinement, something extraordinary happened. 147 German prisoners signed a collective letter addressed to the camp commander, the War Department, and the International Red Cross. The letter, written in careful German and translated into English by the prisoners themselves, detailed their attempts to provide testimony about war crimes and described how Captain Walsh had threatened and silenced them. The letter specifically praised Lieutenant Morrison as the only American officer who had treated them with dignity and listened to their testimonies. They demanded her reinstatement and demanded that proper war crimes investigations be conducted. When Sergeant Davis told Becca about the letter, she was stunned. "They did that. They risked retaliation to defend me." "They sure did, ma'am, and it gets better. The Red Cross representative who visits the camp monthly arrived this morning for his routine inspection. The prisoners gave him the letter directly. Walsh couldn't stop it without causing an international incident." Becca felt hope for the first time in days. "The Red Cross will have to investigate." "Yes, ma'am, and there's more. Your letter to Dr. Hartwell got through. She's been raising hell in Washington. Turns out she's connected to the team planning the Nuremberg trials. They're very interested in prisoners who want to testify." Things began moving quickly after that. A team of investigators from the Judge Advocate General's office arrived at Camp Sheridan within 48 hours. They interviewed Becca, Sergeant Davis, dozens of prisoners, and guards who had witnessed Walsh's actions. They also interviewed Captain Walsh himself. Walsh denied everything. He claimed that Becca had misunderstood her duties, that she had become emotionally attached to the prisoners, and that his actions were aimed at maintaining security and order. "Lieutenant Morrison is a well-meaning woman, but she lacks the judgment for intelligence work," Walsh told the investigators. "She became sympathetic to enemy prisoners and started seeing conspiracies where none existed. I was trying to protect her from her own mistakes." It was a clever defense. He was painting Becca as an emotional, confused woman who had misinterpreted routine security measures as sinister plots. And it might have worked, except for two things. First, the prisoners' testimonies were remarkably consistent. Over 100 men, interviewed separately, told the same story. They had tried to provide information about war crimes, and Walsh had threatened them into silence. Second, Dr. Eleanor Hartwell arrived from Washington with two representatives from the International War Crimes Commission. Hartwell was a formidable woman in her 60s, with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone who had spent her life fighting for justice. She swept into Camp Sheridan like an avenging angel. "Where is Lieutenant Morrison?" she demanded. They brought Becca to the conference room where Hartwell and the investigators had set up operations. Hartwell's stern face broke into a warm smile when she saw her former student. "Rebecca, my dear girl, you've caused quite a stir." "I'm sorry, Dr. Hartwell. I didn't mean to." "Sorry? Good heavens, child, you've done exactly what needed to be done. You've uncovered a systematic effort to suppress war crimes testimony. Do you understand how important this is? I just wanted to make sure the prisoners who wanted to testify could do so. And in doing so, you've potentially saved thousands of testimonies that might have been lost. We're planning the largest war crimes tribunal in history. We need witnesses. We need evidence. And thanks to you, we have both." One of the War Crimes Commission representatives, a serious man named Mr. Patterson, leaned forward. "Lieutenant Morrison, we need you to provide detailed testimony about everything you learned from the prisoners. Every name, every incident, every piece of information." "I have extensive notes, sir. I documented everything." "Excellent. We'll also need you to help us interview the prisoners properly. Many of them have specifically requested to speak only to you." Becca felt overwhelmed. "Sir, I'm confined to quarters pending disciplinary review." "Not anymore," Hartwell said firmly. "I've spoken to the base commander. You're being released immediately and placed under my authority. You'll be working with the War Crimes Commission directly." "But Captain Walsh..." "Captain Walsh is being investigated for obstruction of justice, threatening prisoners of war, and violation of the Geneva Convention. If we can prove what he did, he'll face court-martial." Over the next week, Becca worked 18-hour days with the War Crimes Commission team. They interviewed every prisoner who had attempted to provide testimony. They documented hundreds of incidents: concentration camps, mass executions, medical experiments, forced labor. Captain Weber testified about witnessing the murder of prisoners at a camp in Poland. Dr. Hoffman provided detailed records of medical experiments at Dachau. Dozens of others described what they had seen or participated in. It was grueling, heartbreaking work. Becca heard things that would haunt her for the rest of her life. But she also saw something remarkable: men who had committed or witnessed terrible crimes taking responsibility, confessing, trying to make amends through testimony. "Why are you doing this?" she asked Captain Weber during a break in his interview. "You're condemning yourself. You'll likely be prosecuted." Weber looked at her with haunted eyes. "Because I must, Lieutenant. I followed orders. I told myself I had no choice. But there is always a choice. I chose to participate in evil, and now I must choose to expose it. It will not undo what was done, but perhaps it will help ensure such things never happen again." The investigation into Walsh proceeded in parallel. Sergeant Davis testified about witnessing Walsh threaten prisoners. Guards testified about receiving orders to transfer prisoners to isolation without proper documentation. Administrative staff testified about paperwork being altered or destroyed. The evidence was overwhelming. But Walsh had powerful friends. Officers who believed that prosecuting war crimes was a waste of resources, that America should focus on rebuilding rather than seeking revenge, that dragging out testimony about Nazi atrocities would only complicate the post-war world. Colonel Bradley, it turned out, had been aware of Walsh's actions and had tacitly approved them. He believed that extensive war crimes prosecutions would be politically and financially expensive, and that it was better to let the past stay buried. "The war is almost over," Bradley told the investigators. "We need to think about the future, not dwell on the past." Captain Walsh was trying to streamline operations and avoid unnecessary complications. "Unnecessary complications?" Hartwell's voice was icy. "You mean justice? You mean accountability for genocide?" "With respect, ma'am, That's an emotional interpretation of a complex situation. No, Colonel, it's a moral interpretation of a very simple situation. Crimes were committed. We have witnesses willing to testify. We have a duty to pursue justice. The tension at Camp Sheridan was unbearable. The camp was divided between those who supported Becca and the pursuit of justice, and those who saw the whole affair as an overblown scandal created by an overzealous female officer who couldn't understand the bigger picture. One evening, Becca sat with Sergeant Davis and Dr. Hartwell in the conference room, reviewing the day's testimonies. "They're going to try to bury this," Becca said quietly. "Walsh, Bradley, and their supporters, they'll find a way to make this go away." "Not if I have anything to say about it," Hartwell said firmly. "I've been fighting entrenched power my entire career, my dear. I'm not about to lose now." "But they have rank, influence, connections. And we have truth, documentation, and over 300 prisoners willing to testify. More importantly, we have the press." Davis smiled. "My cousin's paper ran the story 3 days ago. It's spreading. Other papers are picking it up. The public is starting to pay attention." Hartwell nodded. "Public pressure is the most powerful weapon we have. The army can ignore justice, but it can't ignore public outrage. Not in a democracy." The next day, a delegation of reporters arrived at Camp Sheridan, demanding access to the prisoners and information about the investigation. Colonel Bradley tried to turn them away, citing security concerns, but Dr. Hartwell outmaneuvered him. "These gentlemen are here at the invitation of the War Crimes Commission," she announced, "and they will be given access to conduct interviews with willing prisoners. If you interfere, Colonel, I'll make sure everyone knows the army is trying to cover up evidence of genocide." Bradley backed down. The reporters interviewed prisoners, documented their testimonies, and wrote stories that shocked the nation. Americans learned about concentration camps, about mass murders, about the industrial-scale horror of the Holocaust. They learned that German prisoners were trying to testify, and that some American officers had tried to silence them. Public outrage was swift and fierce. The pressure became impossible to ignore. Newspapers across the country demanded answers. Veterans groups split, some supporting Walsh's pragmatic approach, others demanding full prosecution of war crimes. Religious organizations called for justice. Survivors' groups, learning that witnesses existed, begged for investigations to proceed. Within 2 weeks, the Secretary of War himself intervened. A formal announcement was made. The United States would fully support war crimes prosecutions, would preserve all testimony from willing witnesses, and would cooperate fully with the international tribunal being planned at Nuremberg. Captain Walsh was formally charged with obstruction of justice, conduct unbecoming an officer, and violation of the Geneva Convention. Colonel Bradley was relieved of command and forced into early retirement. And Lieutenant Rebecca Morrison was promoted to captain and assigned to the Judge Advocate General's War Crimes Investigation Unit. The hearing for Walsh's court-martial was held at Fort Meade in Maryland. Becca was called as a key witness. She testified for 3 hours, describing in detail how Walsh had systematically threatened and silenced prisoners trying to provide testimony about war crimes. Walsh's defense attorney tried to discredit her. "Lieutenant Morrison, isn't it true that you became emotionally attached to these prisoners? That you saw them as victims rather than enemies?" "I saw them as human beings, sir. Some guilty of terrible crimes, some simply soldiers, all entitled to treatment according to law." "But you developed sympathy for them. You wanted to help them." "I wanted to help justice, sir. There's a difference." "You're a woman, Lieutenant. Isn't it natural that you would be more emotional, more sympathetic, less able to maintain professional distance?" Becca looked directly at the panel of officers judging the case. "I documented every testimony with precision and accuracy. I followed protocols exactly. I maintained professional boundaries at all times. If that's emotional behavior, then emotion serves justice better than the cold indifference that allowed genocide to be ignored." The courtroom was silent. Walsh's attorney changed tactics. Captain Walsh was trying to avoid complications. War crimes prosecutions are expensive, time-consuming, politically difficult. "Justice usually is," Becca interrupted. "That doesn't make it optional." When Sergeant Davis testified, he was equally powerful. He described witnessing Walsh threaten prisoners, described the pattern of suspicious transfers, described how he had been told by superior officers to keep quiet about what he saw. "Why did you choose to help Lieutenant Morrison instead of following orders?" Walsh's attorney asked. "Because I spent my whole career following orders that I knew were wrong," Davis said quietly. "Accepting discrimination, accepting injustice, telling myself it wasn't my place to object. When I saw Lieutenant Morrison standing up for what was right even though it would cost her everything, I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore. Some orders deserve to be disobeyed." The prisoners themselves provided the most damning testimony. Captain Weber, Dr. Hoffman, and dozens of others described their attempts to confess what they had witnessed and how Walsh had silenced them. "He told me that America was not interested in our guilt," Weber testified. "That we should forget what we saw and be grateful for American mercy, but I cannot forget. The victims deserve to be remembered. The truth deserves to be told. And Lieutenant Morrison was the only American officer who understood that." The court-martial lasted 5 days. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Captain Walsh was dishonorably discharged from the Army, stripped of rank and pension, and sentenced to 5 years in military prison. As the verdict was read, Walsh stood rigid, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. As MPs led him away, he looked directly at Becca. "You destroyed my career," he said. "No," Becca replied quietly. "You destroyed it yourself by choosing power over justice." After the trial, Dr. Hartwell took Becca to lunch in Washington. "You've become quite famous, my dear," Hartwell said. "The newspapers are calling you a hero." "I'm not a hero, I just did my job." "You did far more than that. You stood up to superior officers. You risked your career. You fought for justice when it would have been easier to look away. That's the definition of heroism." "I was scared the whole time," Becca admitted. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite fear." Hartwell paused. "I have a proposition for you. The War Crimes Commission needs investigators, interviewers, analysts, people who understand that justice requires both intelligence and humanity. People like you. Would you be interested in working on the Nuremberg trials and beyond? This will be years of work, Rebecca, documenting crimes, finding witnesses, building cases. It won't be glamorous. It will be heartbreaking and exhausting, but it will matter." Becca thought about Captain Weber's haunted eyes, about Dr. Hoffman's shaking hands, about all the prisoners who had chosen to confess their guilt because they believed in justice. "Yes," she said, "I'm interested." Over the next 3 years, Becca worked on the largest war crimes investigation in history. She interviewed thousands of witnesses, both victims and perpetrators. She documented atrocities that made her weep. She helped build cases that brought hundreds of war criminals to justice. The prisoners from Camp Sheridan became key witnesses at Nuremberg and other trials. Captain Weber testified about the murder of civilians in Poland. Dr. Hoffman testified about medical experiments at Dachau. Their testimonies, and those of hundreds of others, helped establish the historical record of Nazi crimes and set precedents for international law that would last for generations. Sergeant Marcus Davis was promoted to warrant officer and assigned to work with the War Crimes Commission as well, helping to locate and interview African American soldiers who had witnessed atrocities during the liberation of concentration camps. His work helped ensure that black soldiers' contributions to documenting Nazi crimes were recognized and preserved. In 1948, as the major trials concluded, Becca received a letter from Captain Friedrich Weber. He had been convicted of war crimes for his participation in massacres in Poland and was serving a prison sentence. "Dear Captain Morrison, I write to thank you one final time. Because you listened to me, because you fought for justice, I was able to tell the truth about what I did and what I witnessed. I was able to accept responsibility for my crimes. I am serving my sentence, and I deserve every day of it. But I also want you to know that you gave me something I thought I had lost forever: my humanity. By treating me with dignity even as I confessed terrible things, you showed me that redemption is possible through truth and accountability. The world needs more people like you, Captain Morrison. People who believe in justice even when it's difficult, who see the humanity in everyone even when they are enemies, who have the courage to stand up against power. Thank you for being such a person. Thank you for refusing to stay silent. Thank you for ensuring that the victims were not forgotten and that the guilty were held accountable. With deepest respect and gratitude. Friedrich Weber. Becca folded the letter carefully and placed it in a box with other letters from survivors, witnesses, and others touched by the trials. That evening, she attended a ceremony at the War Department honoring those who had contributed to the war crimes prosecutions. She stood in a room full of generals, diplomats, lawyers, and investigators, feeling small and uncertain. Dr. Hartwell appeared at her side. "You look overwhelmed, my dear." "I am all these important people." "You're one of them, Rebecca. You changed the course of history. You ensured that justice was served. You gave voice to victims who had no voice and held perpetrators accountable who thought they would escape consequences." "I was just trying to do the right thing. That's all any of us can do, but so few actually do it when it costs them something." Hartwell smiled. "You were mocked, dismissed, threatened, and nearly court-martialed, but you didn't give up. You didn't stay silent, and because of that, justice prevailed." Later in the ceremony, Becca was awarded the Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services. As she accepted the medal, she thought about that first day at Camp Sheridan, when Captain Walsh had dismissed her as just a woman doing clerical work. She thought about all the men who had underestimated her, mocked her, tried to stop her. And she thought about the 500,000 German soldiers who had chosen to surrender to American forces because they believed America stood for justice and human rights. In her acceptance speech, Becca spoke about why those soldiers had surrendered. "They chose to surrender to us because they believed we were different from the regime they served. They believed we valued human life, respected law, pursued justice. And many of them were willing to testify against their own government, to confess their own crimes, because they trusted that America would give them a fair hearing." She paused, looking out at the audience. Captain Walsh and others tried to betray that trust. They tried to silence witnesses and bury evidence because they thought justice was too expensive, too complicated, too difficult. But they were wrong. Justice is never too expensive, truth is never too complicated, and doing what's right is never too difficult, it's just sometimes costly. The soldiers who surrendered to us made the right choice. They chose justice over tyranny, and we proved them right by pursuing accountability even when it was hard, even when powerful people said we should look away. I'm honored to receive this award, but the real heroes are the witnesses who had the courage to testify, the victims who survived to tell their stories, and the people like Sergeant Davis who stood up for what was right even when it cost them everything. They remind us that justice requires not just laws, but people willing to fight for those laws even against opposition from their own side. The speech was reprinted in newspapers across the country. It became required reading at the Judge Advocate General's School. Decades later, it would be cited in discussions of military ethics and the responsibility to report war crimes. But for Becca, the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. 6 months after the ceremony, she received a package from Germany. Inside was a hand-carved wooden box. A note explained that it had been made by former prisoners from Camp Sheridan, now back home in Germany and working to rebuild their country. The box was inscribed in both German and English. "To Captain Rebecca Morrison, who taught us that justice and mercy can coexist, and that courage sometimes means simply refusing to stay silent. Thank you for listening." Inside the box were letters from dozens of former prisoners, men who had testified at trials, men who were serving sentences for their crimes, men who were trying to build new lives in a devastated Germany. They all said essentially the same thing. Thank you for treating us like human beings, for giving us the chance to tell the truth, for showing us that accountability is the first step toward redemption. Becca kept the box on her desk for the rest of her career. Whenever she faced difficult decisions, whenever she was tempted to take the easy path instead of the right one, she looked at it and remembered. She remembered 52 Japanese prisoners bowing to Lieutenant Emily Chen in respect for her kindness. She remembered German women prisoners eating apple pie and tasting hope for the first time in years. She remembered 500,000 soldiers choosing to surrender because they believed America stood for something better than tyranny. And she remembered that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be silent in the face of injustice. Years later, when Becca was an old woman teaching at Georgetown University Law School, a student asked her what she was most proud of in her long career. I'm proud that I refused to be intimidated into silence, she said. I'm proud that I believed in justice even when people told me I was being naive. I'm proud that I treated enemies with humanity even when others said they didn't deserve it. And I'm proud that I proved that women can serve their country just as well as men, not despite being women, but simply by being competent, courageous human beings. But weren't you scared? The student asked. Terrified every single day, but fear is just a feeling. It doesn't have to control your actions. You can be afraid and still do the right thing. In fact, that's the only time courage really matters. Rebecca Morrison lived to be 93 years old. She witnessed the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, Vietnam, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the beginning of the 21st century. But she never forgot those few months in 1945, when a young lieutenant chose to listen to enemy soldiers, document their testimonies, and fight for justice against opposition from her own military. That was when she learned the lesson that guided the rest of her life, that truth and justice are never convenient, never easy, and never guaranteed, but they are always worth fighting for. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply this. Listen when others ignore, speak when others stay silent, and stand up for what's right even when everyone tells you to sit down.